Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Missing Daughter. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm Ali, your host, and it warms my heart to know you're here with us tonight. Tell me, what is it that draws you to these cozy mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss daily stories. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Mother at the Agatha. Afternoon sun had begun its slow descent toward the elm trees that bordered the lane leading to Brookfield Village, and Miss Jane Marple paused to admire the way the light filtered through the leaves in patterns that reminded her quite pleasantly of the lace curtains her mother had once kept in the morning room at St. Mary Mead. Shayhart walked from the station with her usual unhurried pace, carrying a small carpet bag and wearing a hat that, though decidedly unfashionable, served its purpose admirably in keeping the sun from her eyes. She was visiting her old school friend, Mrs. Emmeline Hartley, who had written 3 weeks earlier with an invitation that had been both cordial and persistent. Brookfield was scarcely more than 4 miles from Miss Marple's own village, yet she had not visited in nearly The neglect pricked at her conscience, though Mrs. Hartley's letter had contained no hint of reproach. The lane curved gently past a row of cottages with thatched roofs, their gardens bright with late summer flowers. A tabby cat watched her from a windowsill with the calculating gaze of one who had weighed the world and found it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Cats were excellent judges of character in her experience. One had only to observe whom they chose to approach, and whom they avoided as she rounded the final bend before Mrs. Hartley's gate. Miss Marple became aware of a figure standing motionless beneath the oak tree that marked the boundary of the property. A woman she saw dressed in a navy blue coat that was well made but showed signs of wear at the cuffs. Her hands gripped the top rail of the gate with a tension that spoke of desperation berry contained. Miss Marple's steps slowed. The woman's face was turned toward the house, her profile showing a strong jaw and high cheekbones. She was perhaps 50, with dark hair swept back beneath a plain felt hat. There was something in her posture that reminded Miss Marple of Mrs. Clemens Cook years ago, who had waited by the vicarage gate to confess she had broken the best china platter and could not face the vicar's wife alone. The woman turned as Miss Marple approached, and their eyes met. The recognition that passed between them was immediate and peculiar. The woman knew who she was. "Miss Marple," the woman said, her voice low and strained. "Forgive me. I had heard you were expected today. Mrs. Hartley mentioned it at the grocer's yesterday, and I thought perhaps you might come this way, and I have been waiting because I did not know what else to do." Miss Marple set down her carpet bag and regarded the woman with gentle attention. "I see," she said quietly. "Perhaps you'd better tell me what troubles you." The woman's hands tightened on the gate rail. "My name is Helen Ward. I live at Ivy Cottage, just past the church. My daughter is missing." The words fell between them with the weight of stones dropped into still water. Miss Marple did not move, but her blue eyes grew very intent behind her spectacles. "Missing," she repeated. "For how long?" "Since yesterday afternoon," Mrs. Ward's voice caught. "Emily went out just after 3 o'clock. She said she was walking to the post office. She never came home. And the police. They came this morning. Inspector Drake. He was very kind, very polite." Mrs. Ward's mouth tightened. "He believes she has run away. He said that young women often do, and village life becomes too confining. He said there was no sign of anything suspicious." Miss Marple observed the trembling of Mrs. Ward's hands. the perfectly folded handkerchief clutched in her left palm, the faint shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. She had seen this before, this particular quality of fear in a mother's face. It was not the anger of a parent whose child had disappointed them, nor the confusion of one who could not understand. It was the cold, certain terror of someone who knew beyond doubt that something terrible had happened. "But you do not believe your daughter ran away," Miss Marple said. "No." The word came out as little more than a whisper. "Emily would never. She is sensible, Miss Marple. 20 years old, steady as the day is long. She works at the library 3 days a week and helps me with the house the rest of the time. She has friends. She attends church. She reads her books. She has never given me a moment's worry." Miss Marple had heard similar assurances before, usually just before discovering that the subject in question had maintained any number of secrets. But there was something in Mrs. Ward's voice that suggested she spoke not from willful blindness, but from genuine knowledge of her child. "What makes you certain she did not leave of her own accord?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ward drew a shaking breath. "Her room. Everything is still there, exactly as she left it. Her good shoes, the brooch her grandmother gave her, her savings book with £17 inside." She paused. "And there is something else. The police found a letter on her writing desk, an unsent letter to her friend in Cornwall, Inspector Drake said it proved she had been planning to leave. But that letter was written weeks ago. Miss Marple, I recognized the date because Emily had borrowed my fountain pen that day, and I remember it particularly because she wrote for hours. She never finished it. She never sent it." Miss Marple's gaze moved past Mrs. Ward to the peaceful lane beyond, the cottages drowsing in the late afternoon sun, the ancient church spire rising above the trees. Brookfield was very like St. Mary Mead. She thought the sort of village where everyone knew everyone, where scandal travelled faster than influenza, and where secrets were kept with the same determined ferocity with which one might guard against mice in the pantry. "You wish me to look into the matter?" Miss Marple said. It was not quite a question. "I know it is presumptuous." Mrs. Ward's hands twisted their handkerchief. "I know you're here to visit Mrs. Hartley, and you do not know me, and I have no right to impose. But I have heard of you, Miss Marple. Mrs. Hartley has spoken of you often, and there was that business at the vicarage, and the matter with Colonel Melcher. They say you see things that others miss." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, thinking of the cases that had come to her attention over the years, often in just this way, through desperate appeals from those who had nowhere else to turn. She had never sought such involvement, yet it seemed to find her nonetheless, and she had learned, through long observation of human nature, that a mother's instinct was not to be dismissed lightly. "I should like to meet with you and see your daughter's room," Miss Marple said. "If you would not object to my visiting this evening after I have settled in with Mrs. Hartley." The relief that flooded Mrs. Ward's face was painful to witness. "Oh, thank you, Miss Marple. Thank you. I cannot tell you what it means." "I can promise nothing," Miss Marple cautioned gently. "I am merely an elderly woman who takes an interest in village matters, but I should like to form my own opinion of the situation." Mrs. Ward pressed the handkerchief to her lips. "That is all I ask. Ivy Cottage is just past the church, the one with the blue door." Chapter 2. The empty bedroom. Miss Marple arrived at Ivy Cottage after 8 o'clock, when the September dusk had begun to settle over Brookfield with that peculiar softness that belongs to the English countryside in early autumn. Mrs. Hartley had been understanding about the visit, asking no questions beyond a murmured inquiry as to whether this concerned poor Mrs. Ward and her missing daughter. Word had travelled, as it always did in villages. The cottage stood slightly apart from its neighbours, set back from the lane behind a low stone wall. The blue door that Mrs. Ward had mentioned gleamed faintly in the lamplight that spilled from the front window. Miss Marple noted the neat garden, the well-swept path, the lace curtains that hung straight and clean in every window. This was a house kept by someone who took pride in maintaining standards, who would notice immediately if something was out of place. Mrs. Ward opened the door before Miss Marple could knock, as though she had been watching from within. Her face looked drawn in the lamplight, older than it had appeared that afternoon. "Miss Marple, please come in. I am so grateful you came." The interior of the cottage was as tidy as its exterior. The small sitting room held furniture that was neither new nor shabby, arranged with care around a hearth where a modest fire burned. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, and Miss Marple's gaze moved over them with interest. A younger Mrs. Ward with a small dark-haired child, the same child at various ages. A wedding photograph showing a serious-faced man in a dark suit. Mrs. Ward beside him in white. "My late husband," Mrs. Ward said, following Miss Marple's gaze. "He died 7 years ago. Heart trouble?" Emily was 13. Miss Marple nodded. "It must have been difficult for you both. We managed." There was quiet pride in the words. Emily grew up quickly, perhaps too quickly, but she never complained. "She's always been such a help to me." She led Miss Marple up a narrow staircase to the first floor. 3 doors opened off the small landing. Mrs. Ward paused before one to the left, her hand resting on the doorknob. "I have touched nothing since yesterday," she said. "The police looked through it this morning, but they were quick about it. Inspector Drake said there was nothing to suggest foul play." She opened the door and stepped aside to allow Miss Marple to enter first. The room was small but pleasant, with a window overlooking the back garden. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its coverlet smooth and precise. A wooden wardrobe occupied the corner, its door standing slightly ajar. A writing desk sat beneath the window, and beside it a small bookshelf held a modest collection of volumes. Everything spoke of order and quiet habits. Miss Marple stood very still in the doorway, allowing her eyes to move slowly round the space. She had learned long ago that first impressions were often the most valuable before one's mind began to catalogue and categorize and away the small anomalies that told the true story. The bed was neatly made, as Mrs. Ward had said, too neatly made, perhaps. The corners were hospital precise, the pillow plumped and Miss Marple thought of her own niece's bedroom at that aged cheerful chaos of books and stockings and dastardly abandoned projects. Even the most orderly young woman usually left some trace of morning haste. Did Emily always make her bed so carefully? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ward hesitated. "She's generally quite neat, but no, not quite so perfect as that. I remarked on it yesterday morning when I looked in." He thought perhaps she had been restless in the night and had remade it. Miss Marple moved further into the room, her step soft on the worn carpet. The wardrobe drew her attention, that half-opened door suggesting haste or disturbance. She opened it fully and examined the contents. Dresses hung in a neat row, nothing expensive, but everything well cared for. A shelf above held hats and gloves. Below, 2 pairs of shoes stood side by side. "These are her good shoes?" Miss Marple inquired. "Yes, her son." She was wearing her everyday brown ones when she left. Miss Marple crouched down with some difficulty, her knees protesting the movement. The carpet beneath the wardrobe showed a faint rectangular depression, the fibers pressed flat in a shape, approximately 2 feet by 1 foot. She ran her fingers lightly over the mark. A suitcase shimmered. It stood here for some time, heavy enough to leave an impression. Emily keeps her suitcase on top of the wardrobe, Mrs. Ward said, her voice suddenly uncertain. See, there it is. Miss Marple looked up. Indeed. A small leather case rested on top of the wardrobe, dusty and clearly undisturbed for some time. Yet the impression on the carpet was comparatively fresh. Fibers only beginning to spring back. Curious, Miss Marple said softly. Sheris, steadying herself on the wardrobe door, and moved to the window. The latch was secure, the window closed. She looked down at the windowsill and felt a small shock of recognition. There, faint but unmistakable in the dust that had settled on the painted wood, was the print of a boot, not a woman's shoe, but a man's boot, showing the distinctive pattern of hobnails in the sole. It was oriented inward toward the room, as though someone had stepped onto the sill from outside. Mrs. Ward, Miss Marple said quietly, "Would yo fetch me a lamp, please?" When the lamp was brought, Miss Marple examined the window more closely. The frame was old, the paint chipped in places, but the wood showed fresh scratches near the latch, small marks that might have been made by a tool prying at the mechanism. She turned to look at the room again with new understanding. The two perfected the suitcase that had stood on the floor and now rested undisturbed above, the boot print facing inward. Someone had entered through this window. Someone had something in this room, something that required moving a suitcase and remaking the bed with unnatural and then they had left, presumably by the same route. Carefully closing the window behind them, Emily did not leave through the door, Miss Marple said, thinking aloud. Or rather, if she left at all, she did not pack a bag and walk out in the normal fashion. Someone wished us to believe otherwise. Mrs. Ward's hand went to her throat. Then she was taken. I'm not certain yet what happened, Miss Marple said, though Hermond was already forming theories. But I'm increasingly certain that appearances have been arranged. Let me see the letter the police found. Mrs. Ward crossed to the writing desk and carefully lifted a sheet of paper from its surface. Miss Marple took it with gentle hands and moved closer to the lamp. The letter was written in a young woman's hand, clear and educated. Miss Marple read it through twice, noting the date at the top, which confirmed Mrs. Ward's statement that it had been written several weeks earlier. The contents were innocuous enough. Emily wrote to a friend, named Sarah, about the tedium of village life, about longing for something interesting, to happen, anything at all, to break the monotony of library work and quiet evenings. But Miss Marple's attention fixed on two details. First, the letter was incomplete, ending mid-sentence, as though Emily had been interrupted or had simply lost interest. Second, and more significantly, the envelope that lay beside it was unaddressed. The flap was still tucked in, unsealed. No one writes a letter intending to post it and leaves the envelope blank, Miss Marple observed. If Emily had been planning to live, she would have finished this letter and posted it, or she would have destroyed it. She would not have left it lying on her desk as evidence of her restlessness. Then someone placed it there, Mrs. Ward whispered. Someone who knew about the letter and thought it would support the idea that she ran away. Miss Marple set the letter down and moved around the room once more, looking at the books on the shelf, the photolotteries arranged on a small table, the clothing in the wardrobe. Everything was in order. Everything in its place, too much in its place, perhaps. There was something theatrical about it, like a stage set dressed to represent a young woman's bedroom rather than a bedroom, actually inhabited by a young woman. She paused by the bookshelf, running her finger along the spines. Novels, mostly some poetry, a book on local history and, then, tucked between two volumes, a small notebook with a worn cover. Miss Marple drew it out and opened it to find a diary, though sparsely kept. Most entries were brief notations about daily activities. She turned to the most recent pages and found an entry dated for days before Emily's disappearance. The handwriting was hurried, less careful than Thelator had been. Miss Marple read the brief paragraph with growing interest. Greater than, saw Mr. F. at the greater than station again today with another of his parcels. The same nervous manner, the greater than same careful wrapping. Sarah would laugh at me for being suspicious, but there is greater than something not quite right about it all. I've begun to wonder if I should speak to someone. But what would I say that a greater than respectable man carries carefully wrapped parcels to London? It sounds absurd even to write it. Miss Marple closed the notebook and looked at Mrs. Ward, who is Mr. F. Mrs. Ward frowned. I cannot say for certain. Emily never mentioned anyone by that initial, unless she means Mr. Fenwick from the library. He's one of the trustees, comes in twice weekly to check on things. He makes trips to London, regularly something to do with acquiring rare books for the collection. I should like to speak with Mr. Fenwick, Miss Marple said, and with anyone else who saw Emily on the day she disappeared. But first, Mrs. Ward, I must ask you a difficult question. Can you think of any reason why someone would wish your daughter harm? Any quarrel, any disagreement, that might have made an enemy? Mrs. Ward shook her head slowly. Emily is the guileless creature. She has never harmed anyone. She keeps to herself, helps at church fetes, does her work at the library. I cannot imagine anyone wishing her ill. Miss Marple thought of that eerie entry, those careful observations about nervous behaviour and suspicious parcels. Emily Ward might have been gentle, but she'd also been observant. An observation, in Miss Marple's experience, could be a very dangerous quality indeed. I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that your daughter may have seen something she was not meant to see, and someone has taken great pains to make her disappearance look voluntary. That suggests planning, Mrs. Ward. It suggests someone who had time to think about how to arrange things. She moved toward the door, then paused, and looked back at the room one final time. The boot print on the window sill caught, the lamplighter dark accusation against the painted wood. Your daughter did not run away, Miss Marple said quietly, and I do not believe she left this house of her own accord. Someone came through that window, and they staged this room to tell a false story. The question now is, where have they taken her hand, whether we can find her before it is too late? Chapter 3. A letter she never sent to Mrs. Hartley's cottage, through lanes now fully dark, lit only by the occasional lamp in a cottage window and the pale glow of a waxing moon. Her mind turned over what she had observed in Emily Ward's bedroom with the methodical care of someone, sorting through a drawer of tangled threads, looking for the ends that would allow the whole to unravel cleanly. Mrs. Hartley was waiting in the sitting room with a pot of cocoa and an expression of carefully restrained. She poured a cup for Miss Marple and settled into her own chair with the air of someone prepared to wait patiently for whatever confidences might be offered. Poor Mrs. Ward, she said after a moment. The whole village is talking, of course. They say Emily has run off to London, but I cannot credit it. She always seemed such a sensible girl. Sensible girls, Miss Marple, accepting her cocoa with murmured thanks, are sometimes the very ones who surprise us most, though in this case, I do not believe Emily Ward's disappearance was her own choice. Mrs. Hartley's eyes widened slightly, but she asked no further questions. It was one of her qualities that Miss Marple had always appreciated. She knew when to speak and when to simply listen. I wonder, Miss Marple, she continued, if you might tell me something about the people Emily would have encountered in her daily life. She worked at the library, I understand. 3 days a week, yes. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Mrs. Blackton runs Eat a Widow like myself. Very efficient, and Mr. Fenwick oversees the acquisitions, being one of the trustees. He has quite a passion for rare books. Mr. Fenwick, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. What manner of man-ish? Mrs. Hartley considered this, her head tilted in concentration. Scholarly, reserved. He keeps rooms at the Grey Goose Inn, though he is away to London more often than he is here. He came to Brookfield about 2 years ago, when old Mr. Thornley died and left Thelabury in need of someone with expertise in antiquarian volumes. The trustees were fortunate to find him. Monda's character impeccable as far as I know, though I confess I do not know him well. He attends church irregularly and keeps largely to himself. Mrs. Hartley paused. There was some small talk last year about him and the vicar's daughter, but nothing came of it. Miss Betton married a curate from the next village. Miss Marple filed this information. Owain turned her attention to other matters. She spent the remainder of the evening in quiet conversation, learning's geography of Brookfield society with the thoroughness of a cartographer mapping unknown territory by the time she retired to the pleasant guest room Mrs. Hartley had prepared. She had formed a reasonably complete picture of the village and its inhabitants. Sleep, however, proved elusive. Miss Marple lay in the darkness thinking about Emily Ward's diary entry, about those carefully wrapped parcels and diverse behaviour. She thought, too, about the letter that had been left so conveniently on the writing desk, incomplete and unaddressed, ready to be discovered and misinterpreted. Whoever had staged that room had known about the letter. That suggested someone who had access to Emily's private spaces, or at least knowledge of what might be found there. A family member would be most likely, but Mrs. Ward's distress had been genuine. Miss Marple had observed too many varieties of human emotion to be easily deceived on that point. Morning came with a soft rain that pattered against the windows and lent a grey melancholy to the village. After breakfast, Miss Marple announced her intention to visit the post office, where she understood Emily had been heading on the afternoon of her disappearance. The post office occupied the front room of a cottage near the church, presided over by Mrs. Briggs, whose sharp eyes and sharper memory made her an invaluable source of village intelligence. She greeted Miss Marple with the cordial wariness of one who recognizes that information flows both ways in such conversations. Terrible business about young Emily, Mrs. Briggs said after the initial pleasantries had been observed. Though between you and me, Miss Marple, I did wonder if something of the sort might happen. Indeed. Miss Marple's tone was gently encouraging. She had been distracted these past weeks, not her usual self. I remarked on it to my sister only last month. Emily would come in to post a letter or buy stamps, and her mind would be elsewhere entirely. Had to repeat myself twice one day when asking if she wanted first or second class postage. Did she seem troubled? Mrs. Briggs pursed her lips. Not troubled exactly, more as if she were puzzling something out. You know, Thellock, Miss Marple, like when you're trying to remember where you put something, and you are retracing your steps in your mind. Miss Marple knew Thellock very well. Indeed, and on the day she disappeared, did you see her? That is the curious thing. She never came to the post office that afternoon, though her mother says that is where she was. I was here the whole time from 2 o'clock until 6 o'clock when I close up. Emily did not come in. This was significant. Miss Marple made a small adjustment to her mental picture of events, but she was seen in the village. Oh yes, Mrs. Fletcher. At the bakers saw her walking past at around 3, and Mr. Cole mentioned seeing her near the church, but she never reached the post office. Then she must have encountered someone or something that diverted her from her errand, Miss Marple observed. Did you happen to notice any strangers in the village that day? Mrs. Briggs brightened at this, for the presence of strangers was always a matter of interest. As a matter of fact, there was a man at the bus stop that very afternoon. Tall fellow, thin, carrying one of those canvas bags workmen use for tools. In noticed him because he seemed uncertain about which bus to take. He asked me about the route to Old Mill Road. And did you direct him? I told him the 415 bus would take him within a mile of the Old Mill, though I could not imagine what business anyone would have out there. The place has been abandoned these 10 years or more. Mrs. Briggs leaned forward confidentially. The odd thing was Simile was standing near the bus stop when he saw this man not speaking to him. You understand, but nearby. She had a strange look on her face, almost as if she recognized him. Miss Marple felt a small quickening of interest. Did she board the bus? That I can it say. I was called back inside to attend to a customer, and when I looked out again, the bus had gone and so had Emily. I assumed she had walked home by the lane, as she usually did. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Briggs and made her way slowly back along the high street, her umbrella raised against the persistent drizzle. The pieces were beginning to assemble themselves, though the picture remained incomplete. Emily had left home intending to visit the post office, but had never arrived. She had been seen near the bus stop at the time. A stranger asked directions to Old Mill Road and then she had vanished. The conclusion seemed a dinscapel. Emily had followed the stranger either of her own volition or because she felt compelled to do so. But why? What connection could exist between a sensible village girl and a workman heading toward an abandoned mill? Miss Marple recalled the diary entry, again those observations about Mr. Fenwick Onder's suspicious parcels. Could the stranger at the bus stop be connected somehow? It seemed a tenuous link. Yet Miss Marple had learned that the most tenuous threads often proved the strongest when pulled. She made her way to the Grey Goose Inn, where Mr. Fenwick kept his rooms. The innkeeper, a stout man named Dawson, confirmed that Mr. Fenwick was currently in residence. Having returned from London the previous evening, keeps regular hours. Does Mr. Fenwick, Dawson offered. Up early, takes his breakfast at 8, then off to the library most mornings. Very particular about his tea once. It's strong enough to stand a spoon in. Miss Marple absorbed this detail along with others. Particular people, in her experience, were often creatures of rigid habit. Any deviation from their patterns could be significant. She found Mr. Fenwick in the small library reading room, a tall, spare man of perhaps 45 with greying hair and the pale complexion of one who spends much time indoors. He wore spectacles that hair moved upon being introduced, revealing shrewd grey eyes that appraised Miss Marple with cool intelligence. Mrs. Hartley's friend, he said, his voice cultured and precise. She mentioned you were visiting. How may I be of service?" Miss Marple explained with gentle vagueness that she was making inquiries into Emily Ward's disappearance at their request of the girl's mother. Mr. Fenwick's expression remained polite, though Miss Marple detected a slight tension in the way his fingers drummed once against the desk. "A regrettable business," he said, "though I understand the police believe she left of her own accord. Young people can be impulsive. Emily worked here, I believe, 3 days a week." "Yes, a reliable girl, quiet, competent with cataloguing. I was sorry to hear of her disappearance, naturally." He paused, "though I confess I noticed she had seemed distracted lately. Her work remained adequate, but her attention wandered." "In what way, Mr. Fenwick?" Fenwick made a small gesture of dismissal. "Nothing I could specify precisely. She would be shelving books and would stop to stare out the window. She asked me several times about the procedures for transporting valuable volumes to London. It seemed an odd interest for someone in her position." Miss Marple's ears pricked up at this. "And you travel to London regularly, yourself, in connection with acquiring rare books?" "Indeed. The library has a modest budget for acquisitions, and London dealers naturally have the best selection. In make the journey every fortnight or so." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple sensed a guardedness beneath the words. "Had Emily been with you on any of these trips?" "Certainly not. She was a village girl with no expertise in rare volumes. Her duties were purely clerical." Miss Marple thanked him and prepared to leave, but paused at the door. "One more question, if I may. Were you acquainted with the man who was seen at the bus stop 2 days ago, tall, thin, carrying a workman's bag?" Mr. Fenwick's expression did not change, but his fingers resumed their drumming against the desk. "I am afraid I saw no such person. I was in London that day, and did not return until evening." Miss Marple walked back to Mrs. Hartley's cottage through the rain, her mind working steadily. Mr. Fenwick had been in London on the day Emily disappeared, yet there was something in his mannersome quality of restraint that suggested more knowledge than he had admitted. She thought again of the letter left on Emily's desk, that incomplete expression of restlessness and longing for excitement. Someone had counted on that letter being found, interpreted as flight, someone who knew of its existence and knew where to find it. And Miss Marple was increasingly certain that someone had badly misjudged what conclusion an observant person might draw from an unfinished letter with an unaddressed envelope. Chapter 4. The stranger on the bus. Rain had cleared by afternoon, leaving the village washed clean and glistening under a watery sun. Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Hartley's parlour with her, knitting a deceptively destic picture that concealed the systematic working of her mind. Their needles clicked steadily as she reviewed what she knew and what remained obscure. Emily Ward had left home intending to visit the post office, but had never arrived. She had been seen near the bus stop at the time a stranger inquired about directions to Old Mill Road. Mr. Fenwick claimed to have been in London that day, yet his manner had suggested discomfort when questioned. And somewhere in this tangle of facts lay the reason for a young woman's disappearance. "I believe," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting, "that I should like to take a walk to the bus stop." Mrs. Hartley looked up from her correspondence. "I shall accompany you, if you wish, though I warn you it is a dreary spot. Nothing to recommend it, boot a bench and a timetable." They walked together along the High Street, past the church with its Norman tower, past the baker's, where Mrs. Fletcher waved from behind her counter. The bus stop stood at the edge of the village proper, where the road forked toward the larger town of Alderbury on one side and toward the scattered farms and cottages of the countryside on the other. A wooden shelter provided minimal protection from the elements. Its bench-card with initials carved by idle hands over many years. Miss Marple examined the timetable posted inside, noting that buses ran infrequently in this direction. The 415 to Old Mill Road departed only twice daily, and the route itself seemed designed more for farm workers than casual travelers. Not many strangers would know to take this particular bus, Miss Marple observed. One would need either local knowledge or specific directions. Mrs. Briggs did say the man asked her which route to take. Mrs. Hartley reminded her, indeed, which suggests he knew his destination, but not how to reach it. Miss Marple walked slowly around the shelter, her eyes scanning the ground. "Tell me, Emmeline, what lies along Old Mill Road?" Mrs. Hartley considered. "The old mill itself, of course, though it has not operated in a decade. There are a few cottages scattered along the route, mostly occupied by farm labourers, and the Hendersons have their farm at the far end, 3 miles out. Beyond that, nothing but fields and woodland. Then Danver Mill is abandoned completely. The wheel broke some years ago and was never repaired. The building itself is unsafe for, so the vicar says. He has tried to have it torn down, but there is some dispute about who actually owns the property." Miss Marple filed this information away and continued her examination of the area. The ground near the bus stop was hard-packed earth, unlikely to show footprints clearly. But at the edge of the shelter, where rain would have pooled before draining away, she noticed something that made her pause. "Emmeline, would you be so kind as to fetch me that stick from beneath the bench?" Mrs. Hartley retrieved the stick with some puzzlement and handed it to Miss Marple, who used it to point at a mark in the softer earth. "A boot print," she said quietly, "with hobnails in the sole. See the pattern? Very like the print I observed on Emily's windowsill." Mrs. Hartley bent to look more closely. "You'll think the stranger at the bus stop was the same person who entered Emily's room. I think it very likely, though whether he entered before or after her disappearance remains to be determined." Miss Marple straightened, using the stick to support herself. "What I find most interesting is this. If this man took the bus to Old Mill Road, Emily could not have followed him on the bus itself without being noticed. Mrs. Briggs would have seen her boarding. Therefore, if Emily followed him at all, she must have done so on foot. But that is a considerable distance. Jane 3 miles at least to reach the mill, indeed, which suggests either great determination or great desperation." Miss Marple turned to look along the road that led toward Old Mill Road, shading her eyes against the sun. "You think we must follow the same route, Emmeline, though perhaps not on foot? Is there anyone in the village who might drive us?" Mrs. Hartley's face brightened. "Young Tom Barrett has a motor car. He often runs errands for those of us without transport. I am certain he would be happy to take us." Tom Barrett proved to be a cheerful young man of perhaps 25, recently returned from service overseas and glad of any opportunity to exercise his driving skills. He listened to Miss Marple's request with interest and agreed immediately to take them along Old Mill Road. "I know the route well, Miss Marple," he said, as he helped them into his rather battered Austin. "Used to go fishing near the mill when I was a lad. Haven't been out that way in some time, though." They drove through the village and turned onto the narrower road that led toward the countryside. The hedges grew taller there, creating a green tunnel through which they passed. Miss Marple watched the landscape carefully, noting the infrequent cottages, the long stretches of empty road between dwellings. "If Emily walked this way," she said, thinking aloud. She would have been quite visible to anyone looking there as little cover, unless she stayed well back, Mrs. Hartleth suggested. If she were following someone, she might have kept her distance. Possible, Miss Marple agreed, though it raises the question of why she would follow at all. What could compel a sensible young woman to trail a stranger 3 miles into the countryside? Tom Barrett spoke up from the driver's seat. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but might she have known the fellow? If she recognized him, Lycand wondered what he was about. It was an astute observation, and Miss Marple regarded the young man with approval. That is precisely what I suspect, Mr. Barrett, Emily saw something in this man that made her curious, or concerned perhaps, something she had observed before and wished to investigate. They passed 2 cottages, both showing signs of habitation, then entered a stretch of road bordered on one side by woodland, and on the other by fallow fields. The mill came into view gradually, first its broken wheel visible above the trees, then the full structure of grey stone and rotting timber. Tom brought the car to a stop at a widening in the road. This is as close as we can get, Bemetta, I'm afraid. The track down to the mill itself is too rough. They climbed out, and Miss Marple stood looking at the abandoned building. It had once been substantial 3 stories of solid construction, but time and weather had taken their toll. Windows gaped empty, their glass long since broken or fallen away. The great wheel hung at an awkward angle. One of its supports collapsed. A melancholy sight, Mrs. Hartley observed. I cannot imagine why anyone would come here by choice. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the mill, her eyes scanning the ground. The track leading down to it showed signs of recent use, the grass trampled in places, though whether by one person or many was impossible to determine. Someone has been here recently, she said. See how the vegetation is disturbed, and there, beside Thathasalem, the boot print with hobnails. They followed the track down to the mill itself. The door hung open, one hinge broken, and Miss Marple peered cautiously inside. The interior was diamonds smelled of damp and decay. Broken machinery lay scattered across the floor, and pigeons fluttered in therafters above. But it was not the machinery that held Miss Marple's attention. Against the far wall, clearly visible in the light that filtered through the broken windows, stood a wooden chair, and, draped over its back, was a coat. Miss Marple crossed the uneven floor carefully, conscious of Tom Barrett hovering protectively nearby. She examined the coat without touching it, noting the quality of the fabric, the wear at the cuffs, the buttons of plain brown horn. Mrs. Hartley, she said quietly, would you ask Tom to fetch Mrs. Ward? I believe she should see this. While they waited, Miss Marple conducted a thorough examination of the mill's interior. She found little beyond evidence of occasional use by vagrants or curious children, but the coat troubled her. It had been placidly Barrettly draped with care over the chairs, though someone had just removed it and intended to return. Mrs. Ward arrived within the hour, brought by Tom Barrett in his motor car. She took one look at the coat, and her hand flew to her mouth. That is Emily's, she whispered. Her autumn coat. She was wearing it when she left the house. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I thought as much. But observe, Mrs. Ward, the dust on the sleeves tells us this coat has not been worn recently. It has been placed here arranged to be found. Someone wishes us to believe Emily came to this mill and remained here for some time. But why? Mrs. Ward's voice was anguished. Why would anyone do such a thing? To mislead, Miss Marple said simply. To draw attention away from the true location. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create a false trail, leaving evidence that points in the wrong direction entirely. She turned to look at the empty millet, the broken machinery and rotting timbers, and thought of the careful staging in Emily's bedroom, the convenient letter, the coat arranged just so. Whoever had taken Emily Ward had planned meticulously, creating a narrative of voluntary departure. But they had made one critical error. They had assumed no one would look closely enough to see the inconsistencies. They had not counted on a mother's certainty, or an elderly woman's habit of noticing what others overlooked the more. On the bus came here, Miss Marple said, speaking her thoughts aloud. But Emily did not follow him all this way. She was brought here, or her coat was brought here, to establish this location as significant. The question now becomes, where did Emily actually go? Chapter 5. With the broken hairpin, Miss Marple stood in the doorway of the mill, looking out at the overgrown path that led back to the road. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that reminded her uncomfortably of prison bars. Somewhere in this tangle of misdirection and carefully planted evidence lay the truth of what had happened to Emily Ward. "Mrs. Ward," she said gently, "I should like you to think very carefully. When Emily left the house 2 days ago, was she wearing any jewelry?" Mrs. Ward wiped at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Her watch? It was her father's. She never went anywhere without it. And a silver hairpin, one of a pair I gave her for her birthday last year. They have her initials engraved on them, very small. Only one hairpin. She had lost Theatha some months ago. She was quite upset about Ita's. They were a matching set." Miss Marple nodded slowly. A hairpin with the initials would be distinctive, easily identified, and if Emily had been brought this way against her will, she might have left some sign of her passage. The coat had been placid, but smaller items might have been overlooked by whoever had arranged this elaborate deception. "Mr. Barrett," Miss Marple called to the young man who waited by the motor car. "Do you know if there is a footpath from here that leads anywhere other than back to the road?" Tom scratched his head thoughtfully. "There's an old track through the woods. Miss runs parallel to the road, but stays in the trees. Poachers used it in my grandfather's time. It's barely visible, now overgrown mostly, but it's still passable if you know where to look. Would you be so kind as to show us?" They left the mill and walked back up to the road. Then Tom led them along the verge until he found what he was seeking. A gap in the hedge, almost invisible unless one knew to look for it, revealed a narrow path disappearing into the woodland. "This way, Miss Mindia, step. It's uneven." The path was indeed barely discernible, choked with brambles and fallen branches, but someone had passed this way recently. Miss Marple could see where undergrowth had been disturbed, where a broken branch showed fresh wood beneath the bark. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the ground and the vegetation on either side. Mrs. Hartley and Mrs. Ward followed, with Tom Barrett bringing up the rear. The only sounds were birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. They had progressed perhaps a quarter-mile when Miss Marple stopped abruptly. There, caught on a thorn bush at eye level, something glinted in a shaft of sunlight. "Mrs. Ward, if you please." Mrs. Ward came forward and gasped. "Emily's hairpin." "Oh, Miss Marple, this proves she came this way." Miss Marple carefully removed the hairpin from the thorns, noting how it had been caught. The angle of the bent metal, the small tuft of dark hair still attached to one prong. She examined it closely, reading the tiny initials E.W. engraved on the decorative head. "Indeed, it does," she said quietly. And more than that, it tells us Emily was in some distress when she passed this point. See how the hairpin's broken. One prong is bent nearly double A's, though it were pulled violently from her hair. This was not dropped accidentally. It was torn away. The implication hung in the air between them. Emily had struggled. Someone had brought her along this path by force, and in her resistance, her hairpin had been caught and pulled free. Miss Marple looked ahead along the path, her mind working rapidly. If Emily had been brought this way, where had they been taking her? The path led away from the mill, away from the road. But toward what, Mr. Barrett, where does this path eventually lead? It winds through the woods for a good ways, Miss. Eventually, it comes out near the old Henderson farm, but there's a branching about halfway that goes toward the river. That branch is even more overgrown, though hardly anyone uses it anymore. The river, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. She recalled Mrs. Ward's description of Emily's habits, her love of books, and quiet evenings at home. Not the sort of girl who would know about hidden paths, through woods or abandoned tracks to the river. Bootsomian, who had grown up in this area, would know such things. Someone who had played in these woods as a child. She'd bent down with some difficulty, examining the ground more closely. The earth here was softer, still slightly damped from the previous day's rain, and there, pressed into the mud, was the now familiar pattern of a boot but beside it was another mark, fainter, but visible, the print of a woman's shoe, smaller, with a smooth sole. 2 sets of prints, Miss Marple said. Emily came this way, but not alone. They followed the path further. Miss Marple moving with determined slowness, examining every yard of ground. The boot prints appeared intermittently where the earth was soft enough to take an impression. The woman's prints were less frequent, suggesting either a lighter tread or fewer opportunities to leave marks. Then Miss Marple noticed something else. Beside the path, partially hidden by bracken, were there clear tracks of a bicycle. The twin lines of the tires were pressed into the softer earth, and where the bicycle had been turned, the marks deepened. A bicycle, she murmured. Mr. Barrett said this path connects to the river branch. How far would that? Half a mile, perhaps, a bit more. Miss Marple straightened, her mind assembling the pieces with growing clarity. The stranger on the bus had gone to the mill, but that had been Emily had been brought along this hidden path toward the river, and someone with a bicycle had either accompanied them or had been there before preparing, I believe, she said carefully, that we are meant to find the mill and the coat, but not this path. Whoever arranged Emily's disappearance chose the mill because it is isolated, dramatic. But the real events occurred elsewhere along a route known only to someone familiar with these woods. Mrs. Ward's face was pale. Then Emily might be near the river, or might have been taken there, Miss Marple corrected gently. We must not assume anything yet, but I think it would be wise to inform the police of what we have found and to search along this path toward the river branch. Tom Barrett spoke up hesitantly. Miss Marple, if someone was using a bicycle along here, there's only a few places they could have come from. The path's too rough for riding in most spots. They'd have had to push the bicycle along, which means they were venturing to travel fast, more like they were, well, like they were moving something. It was a chilling observation, delivered with the simple logic of someone who knew these paths well. Miss Marple regarded the young man with renewed respect. Quite right, Mr. Barrett. A bicycle would be useful for transporting something one could not easily carry, or perhaps for making a quick escape once whatever was to Whodunit had been accomplished. She looked back along the path they had followed, seeing it now with different eyes. This was not a casual route. This was deliberate. Someone had known exactly where to bring Millie Whodunit, how to reach that destination without being observed from the road. They retraced their steps to the motorcar, Miss Marple holding the broken hairpin carefully wrapped in her handkerchief. As they drove back toward the village, she sat in silence, her mind turning over possibilities. The man on the bus, the staged room, the coat at the mill, and now this hidden path through the woods. Each element had been carefully arranged to tell a story of a girl who ran away. But the broken hairpin told a different story entirely. It spoke of force and fear of a young woman fighting against whatever fate had been planned for her. And somewhere in Brookfield, someone was congratulating themselves on a clever deception, believing their careful arrangements had succeeded. They did not know that an elderly woman with a talent for observation had begun to unpick their elaborate construction thread by thread. When they reached Mrs. Hartley's cottage, Miss Marple asked Tom to drive directly to the police station and request Inspector Drake to meet them at the cottage within the hour. Tom departed with enthusiasm, clearly pleased to be part of the investigation. Mrs. Ward stood uncertainly by the gate. "What will you tell the inspector, Miss Marple?" "The truth, Mrs. Ward, that your daughter did not run away, that she was taken by force along a hidden path through the woods, that someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to disguise an abduction as a voluntary departure. We must search along the river path without delay." Miss Marple looked toward the darkening sky where clouds were gathering again. "I fear time may be working against us, but at least we now know the direction we must look." Chapter 6. A Visit to the Old Mill Inspector. Drake arrived at Mrs. Hartley's cottage with the expression of a man who has been summoned from more pressing duties, but is too polite to say so directly. He was a solid, square-built man of middle age with a graying moustache and the patient air of one accustomed to dealing with elderly ladies and their fancies. Miss Marple received him in the parlour with perfect courtesy, offering tea that was declined with equal politeness. She then presented her findings with the methodical precision of someone laying out evidence in a courtroom. The inspector listened, his expression growing less skeptical as she described the bootprint on the windowsill, the unaddressed envelope, the staged quality of Emily's room. When she produced the broken hairpin, he examined it with greater interest. "You found this along the path through the woods court on Athon Bush, Inspector. The hair still attached to it matches Emily Ward's colouring precisely." Inspector Drake turned the hairpin over in his thick fingers, frowning. "I'll grant you, Miss Marple, this does cast things in a different light, though. I'm bound to say the coat at the mill seemed a straightforward indication the girl had been there. Had you examined the coat closely?" "Inspector, well, no, Mrs. Ward identified it, and that seemed sufficient." "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if you might accompany me back to the mill. There is something about that coat that I believe warrants closer inspection." The inspector agreed with the air of one humouring a persistent relative, and within the hour they had assembled a small party consisting of Miss Marple, Inspector Drake, Tom Barrett, and a young constable named Willis, who looked scarcely old, enough to be out of school. The journey back to the mill was accomplished in the inspector's own motor car, considerably more official than Tom's Austin. They parked at Thessam, widening in the road, and made their way down the overgrown track to the abandoned building inside. The coat still hung over the chair exactly as they had left it. Inspector Drake approached it with greater attentions as time, lifting it carefully to examine the fabric. Good quality wool, he observed. Well cared for. Mrs. Ward confirmed this was her daughter's. She did, Miss Marple replied. And look at the sleeves, Inspector. What do you notice? Inspector Drake held the coat closer to the light from the broken windows. Dust, he said slowly. Quite a lot of it, particularly on the upper arms and shoulders. Precisely. Now, Inspector Emily had worn this coat to the mill and had been sheltering here. Would not the dust have been disturbed by her movements? Would not the areas where her arms bent show cleaner patches from friction? The inspector's eyes narrowed. You're saying the coat was placed here after collecting dust, that it's been hanging somewhere else first? I am saying, Miss Marple corrected gently, that the pattern of dust suggests the coat hung motionless for some time before being brought here and draped over this chair. Someone wished us to find it and to conclude Emily had been at the mill, but I do not believe she wore this coat here at all. Inspector Drake walked around the mill's interior, his professional interest now fully engaged. He examined the floor, the broken machinery, the empty spaces where birds nested in the rafters. Then her crouched down near the chair and studied the floorboards. No disturbance to the dust here either, he said. If girl had been sitting in this chair or moving about this area, we'd see footprints in the dust on the floor. There are some marks near the door where we've all walked, but around the chair itself, nothing. Exactly, Miss Marple agreed. The coat was placed, but Emily herself was never her, if she was. She did not remain long enough to leave any trace. Constable Willis spoke up diffidently. Begging your pardon, Inspector, but if the coat's a false trail, where do you reckon the girl actually is? It was the question they were all thinking. Inspector Drake straightened and looked at Miss Marple with new respect. You mentioned a path through the woods and bicycle tracks near the river branch. I think we'd better investigate that direction without further delay. They returned to the motor car and drove along the road, till Tom identified the gap in the hedge. The path through the woods seemed even more overgrown in the late afternoon light, the shadows lengthening between the trees. Miss Marple led them to where she had found the hairpin, showing Inspector Drake the exact spot on the thorn bush. He examined the broken vegetation and the disturbed undergrowth with considerably more thoroughness than his initial investigation had shown. Someone came this way. Right enough, he muttered. And recently, too. These broken branches are fresh, can't be more than 2 or 3 days old. They continued along the path, Inspector and Constable Willis in the lead, now their trained eyes scanning for evidence. The bicycle tracks became more apparent as they progressed, and where the path briefly widened, they found clear impressions in the softer earth, same bootprint as at the mill. Inspector Drake said, crouching to examine them. Hobnail's distinctive pattern, and these smaller prints would be a woman's shoe. You're right about that, Miss Marple. The path curved and began to descend to her with lower ground. Through the trees, Miss Marple could hear the sound of running water. The river was close now, perhaps only a few 100 yards distant. Then Constable Willis called out from ahead. Inspector over here, sir. They hurried forward as quickly as the rough path allowed. Willis stood beside what appeared to be an abandoned gamekeeper's cottage. Little more than a single room with a sagging roof and walls thick with ivy. The door hung open, revealing darkness within. Inspector Drake approached cautiously, withdrawing a torch from his coat pocket. He shone the beam inside, illuminating a space that was surprisingly tidy for an abandoned structure. A camping stool stood against one wall. An old crate served as a makeshift table, and on the earthen floor, clearly visible in the torch's beam, with the marks of many footprints. "Someone's been using this place," the inspector said grimly. "And recently." Miss Marple stepped carefully over the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The cottage smelled of damp andethbutt underneath. Those odors were something else, tobacco smoke and, not long dissipated. "Inspector," she said quietly, smelled the air. "Someone has been here within the past day smoking. And look there, beside the crate. That e-cigarette, ash freshly dropped." Inspector Drake bent to examine the ash, then straightened and looked around the cottage with new urgency. He moved to the crate and found tucked beneath it a canvas bag. He pulled it out and opened it to reveal tools engineers, tools well maintained and recently used. "The stranger on the bus," Miss Marple said, "he carried such a bag. According to Mrs. Briggs, I believe this is where he was actually headed, not the mill at all. The mill was merely a landmark, a place to establish in witnesses' memories." "But why?" Constable Willis asked. "What's their purpose of this cottage?" Miss Marple walked slowly round the small space, her eyes missing nothing near the wall opposite the door. She noticed something that made her pause: a length of rope coiled neatly and hung on a nail. The rope showed wear marks in several places, though it had been tied and retied repeatedly. "Inspector Drake," she said, her voice very steady despite the chill that ran through her, "I believe this cottage has been used to hold someone against their will. The rope suggests restraint. The camping stool and crate indicate someone planned to spend time here waiting or watching. And the fresh cigarette ashtas us. They may have been here very recently indeed." The inspector's face darkened. "You think Emily Ward was brought here?" "I think it very likely. The path leads directly to this spot, avoiding the main roads where she might be seen. The cottage provides shelter and concealment. Whoever used it felt secure enough to leave there. Tools behind which suggests they believe their plan has succeeded on. They have no further need of this place." "Inspector," Drake turned to Constable Willis, "fetch help from the village. It went to this cottage and the surrounding area, searched thoroughly every inch of the path from the mill to Heransom Yon. Needs to check the riverbank, particularly any boat sheds or docks." As Willis hurried away, Miss Marple stood in the doorway of the cottage, looking out at the darkening woods. The evidence was mounting, each piece adding to a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. Emily Ward had been taken by force, brought to this isolated cottage, and held here for reasons not yet apparent. The elaborate staging at Demil, the planted coat, the unsent letteral had been designed to convince investigators she had run away, but whoever had orchestrated this abduction had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed no one would look beyond the obvious explanations. They had not anticipated a mother's certainty, an elderly woman's refusal to accept convenient conclusions. "Inspector," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "I believe we must consider very carefully who might have known about this cottage and this path. Local knowledge would be essential. A stranger could not have found this place without guidance." Inspector Drake nodded slowly. "You're thinking of someone from Brookfield itself?" "I am thinking," Miss Marple said, "that whoever did this has lived here long enough to know the hidden places, the forgotten path sand that suggests we must look more closely at those around Emily Ward who might have had reason to wish her silenced." Chapter 7. The Man with the Bicycle. The evening had drawn in by the time Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Hartley's cottage, accompanied by Inspector Drake, who wished to ask a few final questions about the sequence of discoveries. Mrs. Hartley provided tea and sandwiches. which the inspector accepted gratefully, his earlier skepticism having given way to genuine respect for Miss Marple's observations. "I've sent men to search the riverbank," he said, balancing his teacup with the careful attention of one unused to such delicate china, "and will be making inquiries throughout the village about anyone who might have been seen near the mill or the woods on the day Miss Ward disappeared." "I wonder," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "if you might tell me something about the residents of Brookfield particularly, who would have grown up here and would know the area intimately." Inspector Drake set down his cup and withdrew a small notebook from his pocket. "Well, there's young Tom Barrett. Of course, but he was away at war until 6 months ago, and his character is above reproach. The Henderson family has farmed here for 3 generations. Old Mr. Henderson is past 70. Now his sons run the farm. Then there's Carter, their pairman. Been here all his life. Lives in one of the cottages near the river." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Carter, you say? What manner of work does he do?" "Odd jobs mostly. Repairs bicycles, mends fences, does a bit off carpentry. Quiet fellow, keeps to himself. Lives alone since his mother died 2 years back, and his age. Let me see. He'd be about 30 now, perhaps. Went to the village school at the same time as several of the young people here." Inspector Drake paused, consulting his notes. "Including Emily Ward, now I think of it. They would have been in the same class for several years." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the quiet satisfaction of someone finding a piece that fits neatly into a half-completed puzzle. "I should very much like to speak with Mr. Carter. I can arrange that easily. Enough, though, I should warn you, he's not much for conversation. Stammers a bit when he's nervous, which is most of the time around strangers. Nevertheless, I believe it would be instructive." Inspector Drake agreed to call Appen Carter the following morning and to bring him to Mrs. Hartley's cottage for an informal conversation. He departed shortly thereafter, leaving Miss Marple to her knitting and her thoughts. Mrs. Hartley waited until the inspector's motor car had driven away before speaking. "Jane, you suspect this Carter person, don't you?" "I suspect," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that Mr. Carter knows more than he is told. Whether that makes him guilty of anything beyond keeping silent remains to be seen." The night passed slowly. Miss Marple slept fitfully, her mind turning over the evidence, arranging and rearranging the facts until a pattern began to emerge. Pattern that suggested not one actor in this drama, but 2, someone with local knowledge and access to Emily, and someone else, the stranger on the bus, who had played a specific role in the deception. Morning came with weak sunlight and the promise of fair weather. Miss Marple was seated in the parlour with her knitting when Inspector Drake arrived shortly after 10 o'clock, accompanied by a thin, nervously looking man who kept his eyes fixed on his boots. Mr. Carter was perhaps 30. As the inspector had said, with the weathered complexion of someone who worked outdoors. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, were stained with oil and greased the hands of a man who worked with machinery. He wore a wool jacket with worn elbows and trousers that had been carefully darned at the knees. "Mr. Carter," Miss Marple said gently, "how kind of you to come. Please, Ado, sit down." Carter perched on the edge of the chair. Inspector Drake indicated, his posture suggesting he might bolt at any moment. He twisted his cap between his hands, a gesture that reminded Miss Marple of a boy called before the headmaster. "I understand you repair bicycles." "Mr. Carter, yes." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Bicycles and such. Whatever folks need mending. And you own a bicycle yourself. Carter's eyes flickered up briefly, then returned to his boots. I do, miss. Mr. Carter, Miss Marple said gently. I wonder if you were near the old mill 2 days ago, the day Emily Ward disappeared. The colour drained from Carter's face. His hands tightened on his cap, twisting it so violently that Miss Marple feared fabric might tear. I was looking for scrap metal, he stammered. There's softened bits of iron and such around old buildings. I weren't doing nothing wrong. I am sure you are not, Miss Marple said soothingly. But you did go to the mill that day. I might have done. I go lots of places looking for scrap. Inspector Drake leaned forward. Mr. Carter, we found bicycle tracks along the path through the woods, the path that leads to the old gamekeeper's cottage near the river Dot. Were those your tracks? Carter's face had gone from pale to flushed. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the coolness of the morning. I don't know nothing about no cottage, he said, his stammer becoming more pronounced. "E just ride around looking for work and scrap and such." Miss Marple noticed something then, something she had observed before, but whose significance had not registered until this moment. The cuffs of Carter's jacket showed fresh grease, stains dark against the worn fabric. The pattern was distinctive, the kind of marks that came from handling machinery or tools. Tools like those found in the canvas bag at the cottage. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice remaining gentle, but with an undertone of steel. I noticed grease marks on your cuffs, fresh marks, issued say. You have been working with tools recently. Carter's hand stilled on his cap. He looked up at Miss Marple with the expression of a trapped animal. I repair things, he said desperately. Of course I have grease on my clothes. That don't mean nothing. It means, Inspector Drake interjected, that you work with the same kind of tools we found at the cottage, engineering tools. Mr. Carter, the kind a repairman would use. Lots of people have tools. Carter's voice rose, panic evident in every syllable. You can't go accusing me just because no one is accusing you of anything, Miss Marple interrupted quietly. But we are retreeing to find Emily Ward and time may be running short. If you know anything that might help us locate her, Mr. Carter, anything at Ollie, beg you to speak now. Carter's face worked as though he was struggling with some tremendous internal conflict. His eyes darted between Miss Marple and Inspector Drake, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought he might refuse to say anything further. Then quite suddenly, his shoulders sagged and he covered his face with his hands. I knew Emily from school, he said, his voice muffled. We were in the same class, she was. She was kind to me. Never made fun of my stammer like Theophas did. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Inspector Drake. Go on, Mr. Carter. I hadn't seen her much since school. She went to work at the library and I do my repairs. But I'd see her summertimes in the village and she'd always smile and say hello. His voice broke slightly. She didn't have to doth. Most people don't even notice me. And 2 days ago, Miss Marple prompted gently. Carter's hands dropped from his face. His eyes were red-rimmed. Heiss expression anguished. A man came to see me 3 days before Emily disappeared. Sadie had a job for me, paid well. All I had to do was take something to the old cottage by the river and leave it there. He gave me a suitcase and told me to empty it and fill it with old blankets and such, then hide it in my attic. A suitcase, Inspector Drake said sharply. Emily Ward's suitcase. I didn't know who so was. Carter's voice rose again. He said it was for a joke like, playing a trick on someone. He paid me £2 and I needed the money. My roof leaks and winter's coming in. I thought he trailed off miserably. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settling over her. This man, Mr. Carter, can you describe him? Tall he was, thin dark hair going grey at the temples, spoke like an educated person, unlike us village folk. He wore spectacles, had ink stains on his fingers. Miss Marple and Inspector Drake spoke simultaneously. Mr. Fenwick. Carter looked bewildered. Is that his name? He never told me. Just said to Dove, job, and keep quiet about it, and there'd be more work for me later if I did. His voice dropped to a whisper. I'm that sorry. I never imagined it was something bad. I thought it was just a joke, like, he said. Inspector Drake stood abruptly. Where is this suitcase now? In my attic, just like he told me. I was supposed to keep it there until he came back for it. Carter looked up pleadingly. I haven't done anything else. I swear it. I just hid the suitcase like he asked. Miss Marple rose as well, her mind racing ahead to the implications. Mr. Fenwick, the scholar illiterate of the library, had hired Carter to hide Emily's suitcase, which means Fenwick had access to Emily's belongings. Sand had planned her disappearance with meticulous care. The question now is, where has he taken her and what does he intend to do? Inspector, she said urgently, I believe we must search Mr. Carter's cottage immediately and then locate Mr. Fenwick without delay. If Emily saw something that threatened him, something to do with those parcels she mentioned in her diary, then she is in grave danger. Chapter 8. Secrets in the Data. Carter's cottage stood at the end of a lane that ran parallel to the river, small stone structure with a thatched roof showing signs of the neglect Carter had mentioned. The thatch was indeed thin in places, and Miss Marple could see where rain had penetrated and stained the upper walls. Inspector Drake had wasted no time in assembling Constable Willis and a second officer, and the small party now stood before Carter's door. While the repairman fumbled with his key, his hands shaking so badly he could scarcely fit it into the lock. Steady on, Inspector Drake said, not unkindly. No one's suggesting you're guilty of anything more than poor judgment, but we need to see that suitcase. The interior of the cottage was Spartan but clean, showing the careful housekeeping of a man who lived alone and took pride in what little he had. A single room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a narrow staircase leading to the floor above. The furnishings were minimal: a table with 2 chairs, a worn armchair by the small hearth, shelves holding a few plates and cups. Carter led them up the narrow stairs to a bedroom that was equally modest: a bed with a neatly made coverlet, a chest of drawers, a single window overlooking the river. He pointed upward to a trap door in the ceiling. The attic's up there. I'll need to fetch ladder from outside. While Carter went to retrieve the ladder, Miss Marple examined the bedroom with her usual thoroughness. The chest of drawers held clothing, all carefully folded. A few books rested on the windowsill, their titles suggesting a man with modest education but intellectual curiosity. A photograph in a simple frame showed a severe-looking woman who might have been Carter's mother. Carter returned with a wooden ladder that had seen better days, and, with Constable Willis's help, he positioned it beneath the trapdoor. The inspector climbed up, pushing the trapdoor aside and pulling himself into the space above. Miss Marple heard his footsteps moving across the attic floor, then a grunt of satisfaction. It's sheer, he called down, just as he said. A moment later, he lowered a suitcase through the opening. It was small, and made of scuffed brown leather, the kind a young woman might take on a weekend visit. Constable Willis caught it and set it carefully on the bed. Inspector Drake descended the ladder and opened the suitcase. Inside, as Carter had described, weary old blankets roughly folded and stuffed in haphazardly. The inspector removed them one by one, checking for anything hidden within their folds, but found nothing. Miss Marple stepped closer, examining the suitcase itself. The leather showed were consistent with regular use, and the initials EW were embossed in faded gold on the side. She ran her fingers along the interior lining, feeling for any irregularities. "Inspector," she said quietly, "look at the bottom lining. It has been disturbed recently." Inspector Drake bent closer. The fabric lining did indeed show signs of having been lifted and replaced. He carefully pried it up and found tucked beneath several envelopes bound with string. "What's this then?" He withdrew the bundle and untied the string. The were addressed to Emily Ward at Ivy Cottage, and the postmarks dated back several months. Inspector Drake opened the first one and read the contents, his expression growing increasingly grim. "These are letters from her friend Sarah in Cornwall," he said. "Nothing remarkable in themselves, just the usual correspondence between young women, but why would someone hide them in the suitcase lining? Miss Marple, consider at this puzzle. May I see one of the envelopes, Inspector?" He handed her one, and she examined it closely, holding it up to the light from the window. The postmark was clear, but something about the envelope itself caught her attention. She ran her thumb along the edge where the flap had been sealed. "This envelope has been opened and resealed," she said. "See how the adhesive is uneven here, as though it was steamed open and then glued shut again. Someone has been reading Emily's correspondence." Inspector Drake's face darkened further. Fenwick. He must have had access to these letters, perhaps at the library if they were delivered there. "It is possible," Miss Marple agreed, though it raises the question of what he was looking for. Personal letters between friends would seem an unlikely source of threat to a man in his position. Carter, who had been standing miserably in the corner, spoke up hesitantly. "The man what hired me," he asked particular about Emily. "Wanted to know her habits like when she came and went, where she walked, who she talked to. I thought it peculiar, but he said he was planning a surprise for her birthday." "I never thought," his voice trailed off wretchedly. "When did he ask you these questions?" Inspector Drake demanded. "First time he came about a week before Emily disappeared. He seemed to know a lot already, but he wanted to be sure of her routines, and he asked special about whether she'd ever mentioned seeing him at the railway station." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Their way station. That would fit with what Emily wrote in her diary about seeing Mr. Fenwick there with his parcels. A sound from below made them all freeze. Someone was knocking at the cottage door with sharp, impatient raps. Inspector Drake moved quickly to the window and looked down. "It's Fenwick himself," he said, his voice tight with surprise. Bold as brass, walking right up to the door. They descended the stairs, insolence. Inspector Drake gestured for Carter to open the door while the rest of them positioned themselves out of immediate sight. Carter opened the door, his face pale with anxiety. Mr. Fenwick stood on the threshold, dressed in a dark overcoat and carrying a walking stick. His expression was one of mild irritation. "Carter," he said, his cultured voice carrying clearly into the cottage, "I've come for the item I left in your care. I trust you've kept it secure as instructed." "Yes, sir, but—" Inspector Drake stepped into view. "Mr. Fenwick, how convenient. I was just about to send for you." Fenwick's face went rigid. For a moment, Miss Marple saw calculation flicker in his eyes, rapid assessment of the situation. Then his features smoothed into an expression of polite confusion. "Inspector Drakeem, afraid I don't understand. I've simply come to retrieve some tools I lent to Carter last week." "Tools?" Inspector Drake repeated flatly. "Not a suitcase belonging to Emily Ward." The silence that followed was profound. Fenwick's hand tightened on his walking stick, and Miss Marple saw his knuckles whiten with the pressure. "I know nothing about any suitcase," Fenwick said finally. "I came for my tools, as I said. If Carter has been involved in something irregular, that's between you and him." Carter made a strangled sound. "But you told me to hide it. You paid me £2 too. I paid you £2 to repair my bicycle." Fenwick interrupted smoothly, "Which you didn't very adequately. I'm afraid if you've been hiding stolen property and now wish to implicate me in your scheme, that's a rather Inspector Drake stepped forward. "Mr. Fenwickham, going to have to ask you to accompany me to the station to answer some questions about your relationship with Emily Ward and your activities on the day she disappeared." Expression remained combat. Miss Marple could see the tension in his posture, the slight tremor in his left hand. He was afraid. She realized Buff was also defiant. He believed he had covered his tracks sufficiently. "I shall be happy to answer any questions, Inspector, though I must say this is highly irregular. I was in London on Thursday. Emily disappeared as I've already stated. I have the train tickets to prove it." "Tickets can be purchased not used," Miss Marple said quietly from her position by the staircase. "Tell me, Mr. Fenwick, when you travel to London with your carefully wrapped parcels, what exactly are you transporting?" Fenwick turned to look at her properly for the first time. His eyes narrowed as he recognized her from their previous conversation at the library. "Rare books and manuscripts, as I told you before. The library acquires them for its collection. Everything is perfectly legitimate and documented. And yet Emily Ward began to suspect otherwise," Miss Marple continued. "She saw something in your behavior at the railway station that troubled her, something nervous," she wrote in her diary. "Something not quite right. What was it she saw, Mr. Fenwick?" "I have no idea what fantasies the girl concocted," Fenwick said coldly. "If she wrote such things, they were the product of an overactive imagination." Miss Marple moved closer, her eyes never leaving his face. "I think Emily saw you handling your parcels with excessive care, perhaps overheard a conversation, something about the way you transported them that suggested their contents were more valuable than ordinary library acquisitions. I think she began to investigate and you discovered her interest, and that, Mr. Fenwick, is when you decided she had become a problem that needed to be solved." Fenwick's composure cracked slightly. "This is absurd speculation. I won't stand here and be accused by an elderly woman with too much time on her hands and a taste for melodrama." "Then perhaps," Inspector Drake said, "you'll come with me and explain why you hired Carter to hide Emily Ward's suitcase, why you staged her bedroom to look as though she had left of her own accord, and, most importantly, Ward is now." For a long moment, Fenwick stood perfectly still. Then, with a movement so sudden it took them all by surprise, he turned and bolted for the door. Constable Willis was faster. He lunged forward and caught Fenwick by the arm, but Fenwick wrenched free with desperate strength and stumbled out into the lane. Inspector Drake and Willis gave chase boots pounding on the packed earth. Miss Marple moved to the door and watched as they cornered Fenwick against the cottage wall. He struggled briefly, then seemed to collapse inward, all the fight draining from him. As they brought him back, His face was ashened, but High Size held a kind of bitter resignation. She wouldn't let it alone. He said the words, seeming to come from somewhere deep within. I warned her. I told her to stop asking questions. Stop watching, but she kept making notes, kept threatening to speak to the authorities. I had no choice. You had every choice, Miss Marple said quietly, and you chose to silence a young woman rather than face the consequences of your own actions. Now, Mr. Fenwick, you will tell us where Emily is, and you will tell us immediately. Chapter 9. The handkerchief by the river bend. Stood in Carter's cottage with posture of a man who had exhausted all his options. His shoulders sagged, and the walking stick hung loosely from his hand. Inspector Drake positioned himself between Fenwick and the door, while Constable Willis stood ready to intervene should the prisoner attempt another escape. Well, Mr. Fenwick, Inspector Drake's voice was hard. Where is Emily Ward? Fenwick's mouth worked silently for a moment. Then he seemed to gather some remnant of defiance. I don't know what you mean. I've done nothing to the girl. Miss Marple studied him with the detached interest of someone observing a specimen under glass. She had seen this particular variety of criminal before. The educated man who believed his intelligence entitled him to operate outside the bounds that governed others. He would not confess readily. She judged his pride would not permit it. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe Mr. Fenwick intended to silence Emily by frightening her into keeping quiet about whatever she had discovered, but something went wrong with his plan. And now he finds himself in a position far more serious than he anticipated. Fenwick's eyes flickered toward her. You know nothing about it. I know, Miss Marple continued in the same measured tone, that you have been smuggling valuable manuscripts, not acquiring them legally for the library, but stealing them from private collections, or perhaps from the library itself and selling them in London. Emily saw you at the railway station, handling your parcels with the anxiety of someone transporting stolen goods. She began to investigate her. You realized you needed to stop her. Prove it, Fenwick said. Booth's voice lacked conviction. Inspector Drake stepped forward. We'll be searching your rooms at the Grey Goose Inn and examining every transaction you've made on behalf of Thelabree. If you've been stealing manuscripts, Mr. Fenwick, we'll find the evidence. But none of that matters, as Mecca's Visware is Emily Ward. If you've harmed her, you'll hang. But if she's alive and we can find her there, may be some small mercy for you. Fenwick's face had gone grey. He swayed slightly on for a moment. Miss Marple thought he might faint. Then he straightened and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I only wanted to frighten her, to make her understand she should keep silent. I lured her to the old gamekeeper's cottage, told her I had evidence of wrongdoing at the library and needed her help to investigate. She believed me. His laugh was bitter. She trusted me, and then, Miss Marple prompted gently, I tied her up, told her she would stay there until she agreed to forget what she'd seen. I said if she went to the authorities, I would ensure her mother lost everything, that I had connections who could ruin them both. He thought she would be frightened enough to agree, but she didn't, Inspector Drake said grimly. She refused. Said she would never be party to dishonesty, that I could do what I liked, but she would tell the truth when released. Fenwick's shins clenched. So I moved her. I couldn't keep her at the cottage indefinitely. Someone might find her. I took her to the old boat shed by the river bend late at night when no one would see. It's more isolated, harder to reach. I tied her proper lithis. Time left her with water and some bread. I thought I could keep her. there until I'd completed my business in the last of the manuscripts, and then I could disappear before she was found. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settle over her. That was 2 days ago, Mr. Fenwick. If she has been bound and left alone in a boat shed for all this time, her condition may be serious. Inspector Drake was already moving toward the door. Willis, fetch the others. Carter, you know this river bend and the boatshed's there. Carter nodded vigorously, his earlier distress replaced by desperate eagerness to help. I do, sir. There's only 2 boats, both been abandoned for years since old Mr. Thorpe died. One's near collapsed, but the other's still standing. Take us there now. Fenwick, you're coming too. And if you've lied about any of this, see you in the dock for murder. They assembled quickly, a grim procession, through the lanes toward the river. Tom Barrett had been summoned and brought his motor car, which carried Miss Marple, Inspector Drake, and Fenwick. Carter led the way on his bowcycle with Constable Willis, and the other officer following on foot. The river path was narrow and overgrown, forcing them to abandon the motor car and continue on foot. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the water. Miss Marple found the beauty of the setting at odds with the urgency of their mission, a scene concealing potential tragedy. Carter stopped where the path divided, one branch leading further along the river, the other descending toward the water's edge. The boaters are down this way, Miss. Mind your step, it's steep and the ground's treacherous. They made their way down carefully, Miss Marple, accepting Tom Barrett's steadying arm. The river ran swift and dark here, swollen by recent rains. The first boat came into view, its roof sagging dangerously, its door hanging from a single hinge. Not that one, Carter said. Too far gone. Must be the other further along. They continued, picking their way over roots and rocks. Then Miss Marple saw something that made her stop. There, caught on a dock plank jutting out over the water, was a small square of white fabric. Inspector sheckled. Look here. Inspector Drake came to her side and carefully retrieved the fabric. It was a handkerchief, delicately embroidered with flowers around the border and the initials EW. In one corner, the handkerchief was dampened, not waterlogged, suggesting it had been there only a short time. Emily's, Miss Marple said with certainty. She must have managed to work it free and drop it, hoping someone might find it. The second boat stood another 50 yards along the bank of moor. Substantial structure built partly over the water. The door was secured with a new padlock that gleamed incongruously against the weathered wood. Break it open. Inspector Drake commanded. Constable Willis produced a crowbar from the equipment they had brought, and with 2 sharp blows, the lock gave way. The door swung open, revealing darkness within. Inspector Drake entered first, his torch cutting through the gloom. Miss Marple heard his sharp intake of breath, then his urgent call. She's here. Willis, help me. Miss Marple remained outside, her heart pounding as the men worked within the shed. After what seemed an eternity, but could only have been moments, Inspector Drake emerged, supporting a young woman who could barely stand. Emily Ward was alive. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt, her dress torn, her hair disheveled. Her wrists showed angry red marks where rope had bound them, and she trembled violently despite the mildness of Thayday. But her eyes, when they opened, were clear and focused. Miss Marple, Inspector Drake called. We need to get her warm and fetch a doctor. Tom Barrett had already removed his jacket and wrapped it around Emily's shoulders. Carter stood nearby, tears streaming down his face, repeating over and over that he was sorry, So very sorry. Emily's lips moved. Then Miss Marple drew closer to hear her whispered words. My mother, please tell Mimitha. She will be with you very soon. Miss Marple promised. You're safe now, my dear. You're quite safe. As they helped Emily up the path toward the motor car, Miss Marple glanced back at the boat. The handkerchief had been a messenger, small act of defiance and hope. Emily Ward had refused to give up, had continued to believe she would be found, and she had been right to believe it. Fenwick stood under guard, his face a mask of misery and defeat. He had gambled everything on his cleverness, his ability to create a convincing deception, but he had failed to account for it. Mother's love and an elderly refusal to accept convenient lies as they made their way back to the village. Miss Marple thought of all the small clues that had led them here: the boot print, the broken hairpin, the unaddressed envelope, the coat at the mill. Each had told part of the story, and together they had revealed the Emily Ward would recover, Mr. Fenwick would face justice, and the quiet village of Brookfield would have its peace restored. Chapter 10. Truth at the Crossing. The doctor came swiftly to Ivy Cottage, summoned by Tom Barrett, who drove through the village at a speed that would have scandalized the vicar. Under ordinary circumstances, Dr. Haydock was a brisk, efficient man of 60 who asked few questions and concentrated his attention on his patient with the focused intensity of Phone, who had seen too much suffering in his long career to waste time on unnecessary conversation. Emily Ward lay in her own bed, the sheets fresh and white, her mother hovering anxiously nearby. The doctor examined her wrists where the rope had cut into the skin, checked her pulse and breathing, looked into her eyes with asthma tortured, finally straightened with a satisfied nod. She do, he pronounced. Dehydrated, exhausted, some minor abrasions, but nothing that won't heal with rest and proper care. She's a strong young woman, Mrs. Ward. Keep her warm. Give her plenty of fluids and light food. I'll call again tomorrow morning. Mrs. Ward's relief manifested in tears Thatch tried vainly to suppress. She clutched the doctor's hand with both of hers, unable to speak her gratitude. Dr. Haydock patted her shoulder awkwardly and took his leave, pausing only to have a quiet word with Inspector Drake. Wowed in the sitting room below, Miss Marple sat in the chair by Emily's bedside, her knitting abandoned in her lap. The young woman's eyes were closed, but her breathing had steadied and some colour had returned to her cheeks. After a moment, Emily's eyes opened and focused on Miss Marple's face. You found me, she whispered. Mother said it was you who knew I hadn't run away. Your mother knew, Miss Marple corrected gently. I simply helped her prove what she already understood in her heart. Her mother knows her child, knows as Ward knew you, would never leave without a word. Emily's hand moved on the coverlet hand. Miss Marple took it carefully. The injured wrists. Can you tell me what happened, my dear? Only if you feel strong enough. Inspector Drake will need to hear your account, but there is time for that later, if you are too tired now. I want to tell it, Emily said, her voice growing stronger. I want everyone to know what he did. She paused to sip water from the glass her mother held to her lips, then continued. I had been suspicious of Mr. Fenwick for weeks. I saw him at the railway station 3 times always, with the same sort of parcel, always nervous and watchful. The parcels were wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. But once I saw the corner of the wrapping come loose and I glimpsed what looked like very old leather binding far older than any of the books we were acquiring for the library. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. You thought he was stealing manuscripts. Wasn't certain, but I began to pay it. I noticed that certain valuable items from the library's collection were recorded as being sent for restoration or evaluation, but they never seemed to return. Mr. Fenwick always had explanations about delays or complications, but it seemed odd. Then I found a catalogue from a London dealer in rare books tucked inside one of Mr. Fenwick's reference volumes. Several items in that catalogue matched descriptions of manuscripts supposedly away for restoration, and you confronted him. Emily shook her head. I was going to speak to the other trusters to show them what I'd found, but on the day I disappeared, Mr. Fenwick approached me as I was walking toward the post office. He said there had been an irregularity in the library account, something suspicious, and willed I come with him to the old gamekeeper's cottage, where he had documents that might prove who was responsible. He implied it might be Mrs. Blackstone, the librarian. And you believed him? He was very convincing, Emily said, a note of bitterness entering her voice. He seemed concerned and upset, and I had been wrong about him, that he too had noticed something amiss, so I went with him. It wasn't until we reached the he pulled out the rope that I understood. Mrs. Ward made a small sound of distress, and Emily squeezed her mother's hand. He tied me to the chair and told me I'd been too curious for my own good. He said I had no idea how much money was at stake, that the manuscripts had taken were worth thousands of pounds. He'd been selling them slowly over 2 years, replacing them with carefully made forgeries that fooled the other trustees completely. He said if I agreed to keep silent, he would cut Maine for a share of the profits. But you refused. Miss Marple said quietly. Of course I refused. I told him I would go to the police the moment I was free, that nothing he could offer would make him party to theft. Emily's voice trembled slightly. That's when he became utterly angry. He said I was a foolish girl who didn't understand how the world worked. He left me there, bound and gagged, while he went to arrange what he called a more permanent solution. Thibaut, Inspector Drake said from the doorway where he had been listening. He moved you that night. Emily nodded. Very late, when it was full dark. Head drove me in a cart with a tarpaulin over me so I couldn't be seen. The botched was worse than the cottage, cold and damp with water lapping underneath. He tied me more securely this time, said he would keep me there until he could complete his business in London. Then he would decide what to do with me. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. He thought I would die there. Miss Marple felt a surge of anger toward Fenwick, that controlled, scholarly man who had been willing to destroy a young woman's life to preserve his own comfort and enrichment. It was a species of evil she had encountered before, the casual cruelty of those who valued money above human dignity. But you did not give up hope, she said. You managed to walk your handkerchief free and drop it where it might be found. It took hours, Emily said. My hands were tied behind my hand. The rope was very tight, but I managed to work the handkerchief out of my sleeve and position it so that when I moved toward the dock opening, I could drop it through. I prayed someone would find it and understand. And Simeon did, Mrs. Ward said, her voice breaking. Miss Marple found it and knew what meant. Inspector Drake stepped fully into the room, his notebook in hand, but his expression gentle. Miss Ward, need a full statement from you when you're recovered, but for now, can you tell me anything about Mr. Fenwick's single quotes as plans? Did he mention where he was going or what he intended to do? Emily frowned in concentration. He said he had one final transaction to complete in London, that after that he would have enough money to disappear to the continent. He mentioned the evening. I remember that particularly. He said he would take the evening train tomorrow and, by the time anyone found me, would be long gone. Inspector Drake's expression sharpened. Tomorrow's evening train. That would be the 6:15 to London. Actually, Miss Marple interjected thoughtfully, I believe, if one consults the timetable, there is an evening train tide as well, and, given that Mr. Fenwick has now been exposed, he may very well attempt to flee earlier than planned. Inspector Drake consulted his pocket watch. It's for now. The evening train departs at 6:15 from the crossing. If Fenwick has been released into custody at the station, as I ordered, he'll be secured. But if there's been any confusion, he didn't complete the thought, but his concern was evident. He thinks. Miss Marple said, rising from her chair with surprising speed, that we should proceed to the railway crossing without delay. Mr. Fenwick has proven himself both cunning and desperate. It would be wise to ensure he does not slip away before justice can be served. Inspector Drake nodded briskly. Agreed, Willis. He called down the stairs. Haworth motorcar brought round immediately. Miss Marple turned back to Emily. You must rest now, my dear. You have been very brave. Bond, your testimony will ensure Mr. Fenwick faces the consequences of his actions. But for now let your mother care for you and trust that the matter is well in hand. Emily's eyes were already closing with Thank you, Miss Marple. Thank you for believing Mother when no one else would. The journey to the railway crossing was accomplished with speed. Inspector Drake driving the motor car himself, while Miss Marple sat beside him. Constable Willis occupied the rear seat. The crossing lay at the edge of Brookfield, where the London line passed through the open countryside before entering the next village. The small station building was deserted save for the station master, who emerged from his office looking puzzled at the arrival of the police motor car. Inspector Drake, he said, touching his cap. What brings you here at this hour? Has anyone been here in the last 20 minutes? Inspector Drake demanded. A tall man tinkering luggage. The station master shook his head. No one at all, sir. Quiet afternoon, as usual. The 6:15 won't be here for another 40 minutes yet. Inspector Drake exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Then we wait. He'll come. He has nowhere else to run. They positioned themselves strategically, Inspector Drake and Constable Willis, inside the station building where they could observe the platform through the windows, while Miss Marple sat on a bench outside, apparently an elderly lady, simply waiting for a train. It was a tableau of deceptive ordinariness. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The sun lowered toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. A few birds called from the trees that bordered the tracks. The peaceful scene seemed utterly at odds with the tension Miss Marple felt coiling in her chest. Then at 10 minutes to 6 a figure appeared on the road leading to the station. Tall thing carrying a leather travelling bag. Mr. Fenwick walked with apparent calm, hispus, neither hurried nor leisure. Man simply catching a train. He did not see Miss Marple on the bench until he was nearly at the platform. When he did, he froze, his face going rigid with shock and recognition. Good evening, Mr. Fenwick, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I believe you are too late for your London appointment. Inspector Drake and Constable Willis emerged from the station building, blocking Fenwick's retreat. The trapped man looked wildly from side to side, but there was nowhere to run. The railway tracks stretched empty in both directions. The open fields offered no coverant. The road behind him was now cut off. "It's over, Fenwick," Inspector Drake said. "Emily Ward Syphand has told us everything. You're under arrest for kidnapping, theft, and conspiracy to defraud." Fenwick's shoulders sagged. The travelling bag slipped from his fingers and hit the platform with a dull thud. When he spoke, his voice was utterly defeated. "I would have made it work. I'd planned everything so carefully, the staged room de letter, the coat at the mill." "How did you know? How did you see through it?" Miss Marple regarded him with something approaching pity. "You made one critical error, Mr. Fenwick. You assumed that cleverness alone would be sufficient. But you failed to account for a mother's love for her daughter strong enough to reject the easy explanation and demand the truth. And you failed to understand that sometimes the simplest observations reveal the greatest falsehoods. An underdressed envelope coat, placed rather than worn a boot print facing the wrong direction. Small things, Mr. Fenwick, but telling. As Constable Willis secured handcuffs on Fenwick, Miss Marple thought of Emily Ward safe now in her own bed, and of Mrs. Ward, who had never wavered in her certainty that her daughter had not abandoned her. It was a reminder of one, when needed, that the bonds between people often prove stronger than any deception. "Villains rarely consider," Miss Marple said softly, watching as Fenwick was led away.